Hello and welcome to Module 5, as we're going to talk about phonology, the study of speech sounds. Once again, I've listed some vocabulary words for you to start thinking about as we're going through the instruction, and as you're going through your reading, pay some special attention to the vocabulary that I've highlighted. So we've talked a little bit about how language is beginning to develop in the baby as they go from birth to 1 year old to their second birthday and starting to move beyond. We've talked about how cognition plays a part in the development of language. But we need to take a minute to step back and talk about this other component of communication, which is speech. Speech is the oral expression of language. And language doesn't develop independent from speech, nor does speech develop independently from language. They develop together. Just as a child's language doesn't mirror an adult complexity, same with their speech sound system. It develops over time, and they don't start out speaking like adults. They develop the ability to use speech sounds to communicate over time. So we talk about these two go hand in hand, right? With the typically developing child, they are developing both language and speech skills over the course of their childhood. We have to talk too a little bit about what we do know about speech, and that certainly it can exist apart from language. And when it does, we call that term echolalia. Recall that we've talked about that term before in our previous weeks, and that echolalia is the repetition of speech without comprehension of what is being said. Little ones, very young toddlers, will do an immediate repetition of something mommy and daddy say. It doesn't mean that they necessarily understand the content of that language. It's typical for very young toddlers to use echolalia, just that immediate repetition of what it is they've heard, that speech sound combination, but it does not mean that they understand the language that's embedded within the message. As a child goes beyond toddlerhood, echolalia is no longer considered typical. In fact, echolalia, speech apart from language, is a characteristic of a disorder in older children, such as children with autism often represent or have echolalia as a representative part of who they are, and that is atypical in older children. So phonology is the study of speech sounds. The American Speech and Hearing Association, in order to help people really distinguish between articulation and phonology and phonological processes, have started to use the term speech sound disorders to discuss all the different types of errors, developmental sequences, and differences in how speech develops in young children. So the American Speech and Hearing Association now uses the term speech sound disorders. So it helps us as we're talking about phonology that we understand that that term means the study of speech sounds and the rules that determine how those speech sounds can be sequenced into syllables and words, and realize that the phonology of each language is a little bit unique. So I'm going to just kind of reiterate here that phonology isn't just looking at the sound itself, but also looking at the rules that determine how the sounds work together to create words. When we look at a child's ability to understand the phonology, the speech sound system of their language, we call it phonological competence. That child comes to birth having heard in utero the phonemes of their language. And as they experience the world outside of the womb, they experience more and more the speech sounds that are distinct and unique to their language, and they learn to manipulate and use those speech sounds in a similar pattern to that of adults. Again, we call this phonological competence. Let's take a look at this little 18-month-old and how, after being here for 18 months, you think about that for just 1 second, okay? She's been here for 18 months, and look at the competence with which she has managed her speech sound system.
Sabrina, can you say book? Books. Apples. Avocado? Apple. Baby. Is that your baby? Outdoors. What's that? Is that your princess? And your baby? What's that? Where's Sabrina's nose? Where's your nose? Nose. Where's your eyes? Eyes. Where's your teeth? Teeth. Where's your toes? Toes.
So you can see in this video that little Sabrina, while her words are not exact representations of the adult productions, they're getting close, and she is using consonant sounds and vowels that we recognize that are used and are consistent within our language. She's getting very close to the adult model. Phonotactics are the rules that specify which sounds can be placed in order within a given language. So, as I explained before, children come here to life, and we bombard them with words. We start talking to them immediately, and we talk around them, to them, with them. And it's during these conversational bombardments that they start to sort out the information about sound systems, sound combinations, how syllables work together, how syllable structures work together, what sounds we do use, what sounds we don't use. And there's a pruning that goes on so that they become very attuned to the language that they are surrounded by. If we listen to a toddler's syllable string, while it may not represent exact adult language or exact adult speech production, the syllable strings do match the rules of our language. They match the rhythm of our language. They know which sounds go together that follow the rule system of the language in which they are embedded. Let's take a look to listen to this young lady. Oh goodness, it looks like I can't play that one back. Okay, I will put in a different link for you there in class later on. But what you'll hear is her or another child, they produce this babbling type sound, we call it jargon, where they are producing what sounds like speech sound strings, and that they are following the rules of our language. Phonemes are the individual speech sound that is recognized as a specific sound that is distinct from every other sound in that language. So one phoneme is unique compared to every other phoneme. One phoneme is a speech sound that is entirely unique from every other phoneme in that language. In English, there are 44 phonemes. And we use these phonemes in order to form words. A phoneme might be something like this. T, sh, k, r. Each of those is a unique phoneme. When you see, as speech pathologists, we use the capital letter C and the capital letter V in order to describe complexities or combinations of how sounds are put together to create words. So consonant V or CV means consonant vowel. CVC means consonant vowel consonant. And that's how we describe how letters or phonemes are used to make up each syllable. So phonotactics and the duality of patterning, which we've talked about in previous weeks and this week, are principles that help us know which combinations are doable in our language and which ones are not. We would say you can't have 4 consonants in a row, right? Well, that's phonotactics. There's rules that how those need to be put together and how vowels need to be dispersed within a syllable combination. So babies are born with, certainly they've had some exposure to hearing the language of their culture, but they're also born with the propensity to speak really any language and to learn any phoneme set, whether it be Mandarin Chinese or Aborigine or Cherokee or Navajo or French. But over the next few months, there will be a bit of a pruning that goes on that narrows down their perception of speech sounds, and the differences between those speech sounds, their perception of those becomes much more precise. And by the end of their first year, between 10 months and a year old, they really have a pretty good understanding of which sounds they recognize as language and which ones are not. So phonological competence, the idea of knowing speech sounds and how they are approximated in our language is much different than using them. And so while they can hear them and perceive them, they are not yet able to produce them in strings. Because one of the factors, while they're developing language and while they're developing speech, they're also, their little bodies are developing too. And just like the rest of them, their mouth, their oral structures are emerging and forming and still growing. The babies are born toothless for the most part, and the shape of their mouth is designed really ideally for nursing, for feeding, and a little bit of exploring their environment. The shape of their mouth, the parts of their mouth, will grow over the next few years until they have acquired a similar structure to that of adults. The speed and agility with which they can control the movements of this growing mechanism does not reach adult capacity for quite a while. So while a baby can suck well with their tongue, they wouldn't be able to necessarily tap their tip of their tongue to the top of their mouth in a rapid succession, such as ta 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 ta. They wouldn't be able to do that because they don't have the fine motor control yet to manage that. Again, these all develop over time. So because the mechanism is growing, so will their speech sound development grow over time as their oral mechanism becomes better able to manage the movements of speech. So here's a little side-by-side comparison for you between child and adult. It just kind of shows you in brief, at a quick glance, and you certainly don't need to know all of these pieces. It's just to give you a visual representation of the significant differences between that young child and the adult oral structure. As an SLPA student, you certainly don't need to know these differences, at least not for the purposes of this course, but I did want you to be able to take a look and see what those differences look like. Here's what you do need to know. You do need to know the names of the articulators, and the articulators are the places in the oral cavity that we use to make speech sounds. Those major articulators include the lips, the teeth, the alveolar ridge. The alveolar ridge are the small little bumps behind your top front teeth. If you take your tongue tip and run it directly behind your top front teeth, you'll feel some little ridges. It's where we make a t, d, and n sound. That little ridge right there is called the alveolar ridge. The hard palate is directly behind that. And if you take your tongue tip and you squish it on the roof of your mouth and it's hard, that is called the hard palate. The soft palate is directly behind that. You'll notice that little uvula, the thing that dangles back or dangles down in the back of your throat. While it is not an articulator itself, the soft palate is. We use the soft palate for making sounds like And then the glottis is the opening in your vocal folds. You don't need to worry about the vestibule. That's just a space between two things. It is not itself an articulator, nor are the palatine tonsils. That just orientates you to where the parts are in the mouth. But you do need to know all different names of the articulators. And this diagram will help you learn those. So as this young child is growing, they're dealing with the immature structures and formation of their oral mechanism. They have listened to and are listening to the speech sounds around them. They're learning the patterns with which sounds are made in our language. But the reality is they're not necessarily developed enough to produce adult-like forms. And when children have to adapt the rules of how they produce words in order to come close to the adult forms, they use what's called phonological processes. Now remember, phonology is the study of speech sounds. Phonological processes are rules that children use to fit their maturity in language and structure in order to use adult-like forms. They are essentially simplified adult forms. When we talk about phonological processes, we are describing how children are saying sounds. It doesn't explain why they do them. It simply describes what they are doing. Phonological processes are very typical. Most young children use them, but they are expected to be gone by 4 years of age. So if phonological processes persist beyond the age of 4, we consider that to be a delay or a disorder. So what are some phonological processes? Well, here are some examples. Weak syllable deletion or syllable reduction is probably one that you're very familiar with, especially for most little children. They take the weak syllable of words that have 3 or more and drop it. So banana becomes nana. dinosaur becomes diceor. And they just take out one of the syllables. Cluster reduction is when combinations of two or more consonants, like ST or SK, are reduced so only one consonant is produced. So for the word stop, the child says top. For school, they say cool. Some other examples are metathesis, and that's when the child includes all the sounds but mixes them up within the word. So aminal for animal, Paulnellish for nail polish. They transpose them within the word itself. Final consonant deletion, also very common in young children, such as ta for top, cat for cat. And that's where they delete the final consonant in a word. Here are some more. Fronting. There are sounds we make at the back or the velar part of our mouth, the soft palate area. We make the k sound back there. Well, when young children don't make the k in the back of their mouth, but instead make it in the front, t, cat becomes tat, and dog becomes dod. Stopping is when they take sounds that have movement or a continuous airflow, things like f, v, sh, f, s, z. Those are all fricatives or sounds that move, sounds that have a continuous airflow. And children, instead of producing the continuous airflow, they make it stop. In fact, they stop it with parts of speech or phonemes that are called stops. PTK, BDG. Those are called stops. When we describe them, stops is the term that we use to describe PTK, BD, and G. So for the word shoe, where sh is the continuous airflow, that sound is stopped and produced with t, and the word becomes two. Tie my two. Van becomes ban. Everybody get in the van. Let's listen to this young man and see if we can spot the processes that he is using. Do you hear any cluster reduction, weak syllable deletion, final consonant deletion, or stopping in his speech? Whoops. There we go.
What's your name? Dave. How old are you? 2. What does your dad do for a living? Dada. Dada, you dada. New dada. What's your favorite snack? Taki. Taki cookie. Sit down. Key. Do you like being at home all day with your mom? Mommy, yeah. Okay. Do you have a girlfriend? How old is your girlfriend? 2. Okay. I hear your mom does skater competitions. Can I see your muscles? Yeah. Mushroom. What's your favorite color? Blue. But that's yellow. Yellow, yeah.
So you could hear quite a few examples in there of where he is using some of the processes that we discussed. Remember, processes are typical in very young children under the age of 4. Over time, there's some that we expect to be gone by 2.5, some that should be gone by 3, and others that should all be remediated or all should be no longer produced by the age of 4. The impact of the processes on how intelligible a child is one of the ways that we determine whether or not there's a disorder or a disability. If a child is very hard to understand and they have a lot of phonological processes, often we'll recommend speech therapy in order to help them eliminate the processes a little more quickly. So that's phonological processes. Another part of speech sound disorders, or as we talk about speech, the oral expression of language, we talk about articulation. And that's the actual movement of the articulators in order to produce speech sounds. Remember, phonological processes are rule systems. They are not articulation errors. Phonological processes are rules applied to strings of sound in order to simplify them so that children are able to produce them. Articulation errors often also occur in young children, and that's when the child is simply unable to produce a certain sound, such as not being able to say the R as in car or robin. And just as words and grammar, word order, social language pragmatics are acquired over time, so are the phonemes of our language. Early developing sounds are often stops and nasals. I briefly mentioned them in one of our last slides. Stops are t, d, p, b, k, g. You could say P, T, K, B, D, G. Those are the letter names that represent the sounds. Nasals are n, and others that emerge early by 24 months of age are h and w. So these are the earliest sounds that develop. There is no exact age at which each child acquires particular phonemes from our language. There are patterns of phoneme acquisition that we do see as fairly consistent, but it really depends on which study you look at for us to say that yes, children should have their R by a particular age or their TH by a particular age. In general, Schreiberg seems to have a pretty good generalized description of what sounds come early, what sounds happen sort of in that mid-childhood range, and what are the more later developing phonemes. And he's grouped them into what they call the early, mid, and late 8. Often the late 8 are the ones that we work on in speech therapy because these are the ones that are the most difficult for children to acquire. The early 8, similar to the ones we just talked about when I told you about the emergence of sounds that occur in young children, you'll see the b, y, that J is actually representative of a yes sound, w, p, b, and h. And then in the middle 8, we see the emergence of t, n, k, g, f, v, ch. And this little J measure that's written there is the j sound. The late 8 are the sh, f, and v, s, z, l, r, and j. Now that sound there at the end is the one in the middle of the word measure. It doesn't occur a lot in our language. So in general, the sounds that develop the latest, according to Schreiberg at least, are the sh, f, v, s, z, l, r, and j. When we talk about speech sound acquisition, and we're talking about articulation, when they are able to produce sounds easily, we talk about two different things: customary production and mastery. So What we say is if a child or a group of children at a particular age, 50% of them can produce the phoneme in at least the beginning, middle, or end of words, we call that a customary production. So let me explain that again. 50% of 5-year-olds can say k at either the beginning, middle, or end, two of those three of words. It is customarily expected that 5-year-olds produce k. That's called customary production. Mastery is when that phoneme is produced by 90% of the subjects at an age level, and it occurs in the initial, medial, and final, not just 2 or 3 of those positions. Sounds happen at the beginning of words, they happen in the middle of words, and they happen at the end of words. So like cake has a k at the beginning and a k at the end. Popcorn has k in the middle. Each of those k sounds is learned individually. Customary production is they can do 2 of the 3. Mastery is they can do all of the 3, and 90% of the children at that age are able to do it. It's why in speech therapy often S and R are treated very late, because mastery, where 90% of the children at that age level can produce R in the beginning, middle, and final positions of a word, comes later, closer to 7 years old than, say, 4. When we talk about speech sound acquisition and speech sound production, just like we had sort of those red flag markers for language development, you remember first words at 12 months old, 50 words by 18 months, 2 words together by their 2nd birthday. We also have guidelines or milestones that we expect for children in speech sound development. And while there's no real cut and dried absolute for speech sound or phoneme acquisition when it comes to age, we do have some general rules of what we would expect. And intelligibility is one of the ways we look at that. Intelligibility is how much of what a child says is understandable. By the age of 3, we expect that 75% of what a child says should be intelligible. That means 75% of what a child says at the age of 3 is understood by non-family members. By 5 years old, 90% of what they say should be intelligible. So you can see that by the time they start school, I should be able to understand all that they say, or almost all. It doesn't mean they produce it like an adult. It means I can understand them. If they do not meet these intelligibility expectations or indicators, we would say that that child is likely representing a delay or disorder. You're going to learn more about the International Phonetic Alphabet. Its purpose is to give written language to the phonemes or the sounds of a language. Speech pathologists, for one, use International Phonetic Alphabet to transcribe or to write what someone is saying exactly. While there are 44 phonemes in English, there are only 26 letters or graphemes. So we don't have enough graphemes or letters to represent all of the different phonemes. In fact, sometimes we have to use our graphemes or letters to represent more than one sound. Take, for example, a, ah. Each one of those we represent with what we call the letter A. But in IPA, we can represent the sound exactly. It's important for you to learn IPA as an SLPA because it is one of the ways you're going to transcribe your students and share information with your supervising speech language pathologist. You'll have a whole other course just on International Phonetic Alphabet in phonology. So this is just to give you an idea of what it is and how we use it. More will come later in a different course. But here's some examples. IPA helps us differentiate between th and For the, you can see the symbol that looks like a backwards 6 with a cross on the top. And then it's represented by the grapheme of TH, but that's much different than the TH that is represented in the word think. And you can see that the TH in think is represented by a circle with a line through it. Those symbols are International Phonetic Alphabet. Here's some other words. The sound sh, ip. Ship is represented, the sh is with an S and an H. Those are the graphemes. But the sound itself is represented by a very long, skinny squiggle, similar to an S, that represents the sound sh. In the word yellow, we represent the y with what you would think of as a J sound, but it's actually representative in IPA of the y. And the vowels each also have their own symbol in IPA. And as I said, this is just to introduce you to the idea of IPA and how we use it. And it's important as we learn to transcribe and write exactly what children say. You're going to need it, but you'll take another course in it. Do know the term, do know its purpose, but you won't be asked to transcribe in this particular course. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next week.